Part 10. The Ethical Imagination. The unwillingness of most modern aestheticians to consider the ethical dimension of art leads Babbitt to stress it in his own writing. The creative works can have exceptional intuitive power and concentration and still lack what Babbitt considers to be the mark of truly great art, the special imaginative depth and proportion that comes from penetrating the ethical core of existence. That's the mark of truly great art. If it has that special imaginative depth and proportion that comes from penetrating the ethical core of existence. Insufficiently attentive readers have concluded that for him morality is the only proper subject of art, and that the value distinctive to art is ethical good. One generally sympathetic commentator has written that Babbitt regards true art as ethics touched by emotion. Babbitt's real view is quite different. All genuine art is imagination, not moral action, not reason. As intuition, it comes under the criteria of aesthetic concentration and beauty. Also, art cannot be confined to rendering the moral struggle, but must, with its characteristic intuitive freshness, express life in its entire range and variety. As Babbitt writes, quote, "Art, of course, cannot thrive solely, or indeed primarily, on the higher intuitions. It requires the keenest intuitions of sense," unquote. What is distinctive about Babbitt's aesthetics is his view that art can reach its highest humane purpose only if, quote, "the intuitions of sense come under the control of the higher intuitions." Great art does not ignore or diminish diversity. It intuits life's multiplicity in its bearing on what ultimately orders human existence. Within some way of expressing the moral structure of life, art must present unreal, twisted, or unbalanced vision. Utopian, cynical, or pessimistic views of the world reveal the confining selectivity of the will that carries them. Poetry of that kind may still capture acutely and vividly some particular elements of experience, for instance, escapist longing or feelings of absurdity and despair. What Babbitt calls the ethical imagination is certainly not unfamiliar with such states. On the contrary, in, quote, "the higher intuitions," unquote, these intuitive fragments are absorbed into a vision of the whole in which they are more clearly seen for what they are, manifestations of life lacking in ethical order. The number of criticisms frequently directed at Babbitt over the years have shown a curious, indeed scandalous, inattention to Babbitt's actual and explicitly stated views, as if the critics were more interested in discrediting than understanding his ideas. One of these allegations is that he favors moralistic and didactic art. His opinion that great art is as ethically illuminating and elevating is in fact indistinguishable from his emphatic and repeated rejection of didacticism. It is a mark of the ethical imagination, he argues, that it is free from preaching. The mark of the ethical imagination, he argues, is that it is free from preaching. Babbitt admires the poetry of Dante, but he also criticizes it for sometimes being, quote, less imaginative than theological, unquote. He comments, quote, "It is in general easy to be didactic, hard to achieve ethical insight," unquote. Babbitt regards Sophocles as ethically more profound than Euripides for the reason that he, quote, "views life with more imaginative wholeness." At the same time, he is much less given to preaching than Euripides. He warns that, quote, "a purely traditional humanism is always in danger of falling into a rut of pseudo-classic formalism." Babbitt goes to great lengths to show that while the ethical imagination expresses the universal, it does not do so in an intellective manner. Artistic intuition and conceptual thought are different modes of knowing life. The wisdom of great art does not result from reasoning controlling the imagination, but is intrinsic to the higher imagination as such. This wisdom is intuited universality. Genuine art, Babbitt insists, is free of, quote, clogging intellectualism, unquote. Art is not concerned with truth in the way of history or philosophy. The latter are bound by actual fact, whereas art creates its world and its personages. It views life through a veil of illusion, unquote. Through a veil of illusion. But in its higher forms, art does not, so much like a romantic imagination, quote, wander wild in its own empire of chimeras, unquote. Great art conveys the ethical center of reality, thereby illuminating human experience in general. Imagination that does not know, and therefore cannot express, the ethical essence of human existence, lacks what Babbitt calls centrality. Its presentation of life will be fragmentary, disproportionate, warped. What has been superficially interpreted by aesthetic moralism, didacticism, or intellectualism is Babbitt's opposition to art that distorts or lacks the fullness of life. He knows as well as his critics that art has its own aesthetic needs, that it opens up new and sometimes unexpected potentialities of experience, and that it liberates man from deadening routine. Among the things that the highest forms of imagination creatively expresses is the ethical import of human existence. Imagination capable of this kind of intuition is concentric as opposed to eccentric, which is one of my favorite things to talk about, which does not mean that it is stagnant and stationary. This is the concept that all the authors of all the great books seem to be writing their books with the same hand, always moving towards, zeroing in on this immovable center of truth. And once you get there, then you start filling yourself up on it, and you find that your mind and your soul and your will expand. If modern people are willing to direct their lives by outer standards, a reluctance to which Babbitt gives qualified assent, they must seek guidance in the ethically sensitive creativity of higher imagination. Quote, to assert the creativeness of the human imagination is incompatible with centrality, or what amounts to the same thing with purpose, is to assert that the creativeness of the imagination is incompatible with reality, or at least such reality as man may attain. The aestheticism of l'art pour l'art, or art for art's sake, detaches art from the deeper stratum of human experience. To indulge imagination that recognizes no higher aim to human life, Babbitt writes, is, quote, to run the risk of taking some cloud bank for terra firma, unquote. God, I love that one. The literary credo of Peter Weyrich succinctly formulates what is also Babbitt's aesthetic position. Writing in the 1950s, Weyrich rejects both soapbox poetry and formalistic virtuosity. Why, quote, why confine poetry to this false choice between agate prop and furniture polish? we have a third alternative, not the moral preachiness of didacticism, but the moral insight of lyrical humanity, unquote. Poetry without ethical center is poetry without genuine humanity. Devotees of aestheticistic formalism do not understand that, quote, you will capture beauty only by seeking more than beauty. Wow. Beauty that does not express our higher humanity tends to lose also its beauty. What dehumanizes, delyricizes. Poetic vision, whether created or recreated by us, draws the whole personality into itself. If we have some moral character, a part of the experience of the poem is the reaction of our ethical consciousness, or conscience. To the extent that the poetic vision ignores or violates this concern of the higher will, the moral uneasiness of the participating self creates a dissonance within the aesthetic vision. If, by contrast, the poem successfully conveys the presence of a higher will in the world, it expresses our deepest humanity and pulsates with reality itself. For a mature and sensitive critic to record these reactions of his own aesthetically participating self has nothing to do with applying rules of moralistic censorship. The critic is passing judgment on the imaginative depth and range of the poem. Irving Babbitt has long been vilified by aestheticians who reject out of hand any effort to connect art and moral value. Because they're idiots. It is a great intellectual irony that Babbitt's aesthetical position should have been belatedly confirmed by the philosophical authority who, more than any other, may have inspired the amoralism of L'Art pour l'Art, Benedetto Croce. Croce substantially revised his influential early views as formulated in The Aesthetic that Croce wrote in 1902, and in that book he had emphasized intuition as being the perception of individuality and concreteness. Beginning around 1917, however, Croce gave increasing attention to artistic intuition as joining individuality and universality, the theme of Babbitt's aesthetics. With time, Croce's opinion became difficult to distinguish from the views stressed by Babbitt in opposition to aestheticism, that imagination can and should present the universal. As Croce wrote in 1917, quote, in every poetic accent, in every imaginative creation, there lies all human destiny, all the hopes, the illusions, the sorrows, the joys, the greatness, and the wretchedness of humanity, the entire drama of reality. It is therefore unthinkable that artistic representation may ever affirm the mere particular, the abstract individual, the finite in its finiteness. Unquote. Croce also accepted Babbitt's idea that art achieves greatness in proportion as it expresses the ethical essence of human existence. In great art, Croce argues, the whole of the human spirit is intuited. Such art, totalite, the totality includes the, I didn't take Latin. That totality includes the ethical purpose of life. Stating in 1970 a view for which Babbitt was being attacked by advocates of L'Art pour l'Art, Croce wrote, if the moral force is, as it certainly is, a cosmic force and queen of the world, it dominates by its own power, and art is more perfect the more clearly it reflects and expresses the development of reality. The more it is art, the better it shows the morality inherent in the nature of things. Mark one up for Babbitt there. It is simply not plausible to suspect Croce of doctrinaire neoclassicism, moralism, or didacticism. Like Babbitt, he looks to art to capture life with fullness, depth, and proportion. The aestheticians who applauded Croce's brilliance when he formulated his earliest aesthetics did not follow his lead as Croce's thought evolved. Doing so would have placed them in an embarrassing proximity to their bête noire, Irving Babbitt. Checkmate.